Perfect. So I'm delighted to have the opportunity to welcome everyone to our event on the upcoming French elections. I'm Catherine Cleppenger. I'm the program director of the Upper Division French Literature and Culture program here at GW. And I am delighted to welcome my three speakers today. I'll be introducing them in just 1 second. Just to set the stage, I imagine everyone here knows that the French elections are coming up. It is done as a 2-round election system with the first round of elections occurring on April 10th and the second round on April 24th. So things are moving quite quickly. And obviously with everything going on in Europe, things are moving in ways that were not even predictable just 2 weeks ago. I wanted to just begin by giving everyone a list, a sort of visual bookmark on what the elections look like right now. Here we have the first round. So these are the candidates, and this is not 100% up to date right now, just because this is the official polling sources and it takes a little bit of time. But as you can see, it's a race with a clear front runner and a clear range of opinions and political positionings. And I know that our speakers today will be covering a lot of the ground here. But I did want to just note that it's a very wide playing field with quite a few well-known candidates, lesser-known candidates, repeat candidates, kind of all in the mix. So this is what it looks like for the first round. The second round is usually a runoff, and it's looking likely that the runoff will be between Macron and Marine Le Pen. And when we go to the second round kind of guesses, this is what we're looking at in terms of how things might shake out on April 24th. Obviously, this puts Macron in the front runner position for a second term, but also at the same time, nothing's guaranteed. This is not anywhere near a slam dunk for anyone in this particular instance. So to help us understand what's going on both domestically and internationally, I'm delighted to have 3 speakers joining us today. I will introduce each one before they speak as a way to anchor the conversation. And so my first guest today is Art Goldhammer, who is joining us from Cambridge, Massachusetts. And he is a writer, translator, and senior affiliate of the Center for European Studies at Harvard University. He's the translator of more than 125 books from the French, for which he has received many honors. Among his translations are the major works of Alexis de Tocqueville and Thomas Piketty. He writes widely on French politics and culture and is the author of the novel Shooting War. I'll just add as a personal note, he didn't put this in his official bio, but he is the author of an extraordinary blog on French politics and culture that you can find on the Tocqueville 21 for 21st Century site. I've been following his blog for over a decade at this point, and it has been one of the most useful sources to me for understanding everything going on in France. And it was really thanks to everything I've learned from his blog over the years that made me think he would be such a great person to join us today. So Art, thank you so much for joining us, and we will send it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Catherine, for that very kind introduction. And thanks to you and Hillary for the invitation to participate in this event. I don't know if I'm on the screen. I'm looking at a picture of a mother and child, it looks like. But anyway, I'll assume that the tech is working correctly and start in on my talk. I have 3 main takeaways today. The first is going to be that political parties matter less than they ever did before in French politics, and the media matter more. My second main point is that this election is already over. I hope I'm not wrong in predicting a Macron victory, as wrong as I was when I predicted a Hillary Clinton victory in 2016 in the United States. But my feeling, and I think the feeling of most political professionals, as I will show in a moment, is that Macron is going to win. And therefore, what we see going on in French politics today is not so much a political campaign as a realignment in anticipation of the 2027 election. Now, in regard to my first point, I can already feel your skeptical hackles being raised, because when I say that political parties don't count in French presidential politics as much as they used to, you might well ask, well, wasn't the French presidential system devised by de Gaulle precisely to sideline the parties and entirely built around individual charisma, which de Gaulle brought to the table in spades? And didn't de Gaulle's determination to control the media suggest that he fully recognized its power to shape democratic outcomes? Indeed, it's true that de Gaulle saw the presidency as a kind of apotheosis, as he put it, the encounter of an individual and the nation. All that's true, but from 1969 to 2017, the route to the French president, that is 1969 when de Gaulle retired from French politics, to 2017 when Macron was elected, the route to the presidency passed through one of the two major parties. One rose through party ranks, defeated one's rivals, and earned the party nomination. This was the case for Mitterrand, Chirac, Jospin, who never became president, but who was the socialist candidate in '95, Sarkozy, and Hollande. Giscard d'Estaing was a mild exception to this rule. I won't go into the details of the way he became a candidate, but even his case demonstrates that parties really mattered in the past throughout that 40-plus year period. Now, the demise of the party system was aided and abetted by two reforms: the change of the presidential term from 7 to 5 years, which happened under Chirac, despite Chirac's skepticism about the wisdom of that reform. And then in 2014, reform of the law on the cumul des mandats. In France, it used to be allowed that one could be both a deputy, a member of the National Assembly, and also hold an executive position at the local level, such as mayor. And this was a common way of distributing power and assuring a kind of check and balance against the presidency. But that was changed in 2014. Nevertheless, the real collapse of the party system came about in 2017 for two reasons. First, the media combined with Macron to create a personal myth around a candidate, which together with a set of fortuitous circumstances propelled him to victory. Again, party primary knocked off the Republican Party's strongest candidate, Alain Juppé, and then the candidate chosen by the primary, François Fillon, was eliminated by scandal, while the natural candidate of the left, the sitting president, François Hollande, was done in by his own failures. Now, another key point is that the 2017 election was a watershed. It demonstrated both two things. Both the left and the right, the coalitions of both the left and the right had begun to disintegrate. The left fell back into a division between a party of government and a party that preferred ideological consistency to power, as in the pre-Mitterrand era. And the party of government suffered from the discredit of the Hollande presidency. Now, while the right found itself facing a growing Le Pen phenomenon, after thinking it had defeated Le Penism once and for all in 2007, with Sarkozy's candidate, which saw the party veering sharply to the right, it nevertheless was already showing signs of a split, which we'll talk about more in 2002 as that split has matured. So here we are in 2022. The former mainstream parties are both in their death throes. Philippe Marlière will talk in a moment about the left, so I'll concentrate my remarks on the right. What do we see on the right? First of all, we see desertions in both directions from the Republican Party. Raffarin, a former prime minister, and Wörth, former economics minister, have jumped from the Republicans to Macron. Sarkozy has not yet endorsed the candidate of his own party. Rachida Dati, who was a minister under Sarkozy, has been openly critical of the party's candidate, Valérie Pécresse. Laurent Wauquiez, who was party chairman for a while, has been silent. Guillaume Peltier has bolted to Zemmour. Éric Ciotti, who finished second in the Republican primary to Pécresse, the party candidate, has said that if she does not make it to the second round, he's going to support her rival, Éric Zemmour. So we see the Republican Party disintegrating before our eyes. At the same time, Le Pen, who was thought to be the major rival to Macron until the emergence of Éric Zemmour, is also suffering desertions. Just this morning, she received the unkindest cut of all when her niece, Marichon Maréchal, whom she raised as a child, announced that she was deserting to support Éric Zemmour's splinter candidacy on the right. Jean-Marie Le Pen had already said that Éric Zemmour was his kind of candidate, but the split between him and his daughter goes way back. And there have been other desertions from Le Pen's party, as we'll see in a moment. So why is this happening? Why is Pécresse, who in many ways is a clone of Macron, why is she losing the support of her own party? Well, there are many possible explanations. Misogyny is never to be discounted. Women have always had a hard time in French presidential politics. Just think of the candidacy of Ségolène Royal in 2007 and how that was sabotaged by her own party. There's also a matter of personal animosity. There's flip-flopping by the candidate herself. Pécresse quit her party when Wauquiez became the chairman on the grounds that it had moved too far to the right. But now she rejoined the party and herself, recognizing the handwriting on the wall, moved to the right and has made herself quite close to Éric Ciotti, the candidate of the right wing of the party in the primary in this election. So her flip-flopping has undermined herself, her own candidacy. Now, the future is open. First, in the next 5 years, because of Macron's local absence, the real contest this year will be in the legislative elections. And second, there's a contest over the post-Macron era. What kind of party will be the party of the right? And that question has been raised very forcefully by what I'll call the Zemmour phenomenon, which has reshaped the right, precipitating, I'll argue, a party realignment. Zemmour is a creation of the media in one sense. He himself is a media personality, much like Donald Trump. First came to my notice more than a decade ago when he was a participant in a kind of infotainment show run by Laurent Wauquiez, in which he served as a kind of literary critic and political commentator. And he established during that period as a TV commentator quite a loyal following. More recently, he had his own news program on Say News, where for an hour per day, until he announced his candidacy and was reined in by the agency which regulates the airtime allowed to each candidate under the rules of the French presidential system. What I wanted to show was the degree to which press coverage of Zemmour outstripped that of all other candidates. If you look at all the candidates to the right, the number of articles published in the press about Zemmour was about 4 times the number devoted to each of the other candidates of the right. The only figure who has attracted more press attention than Zemmour throughout the last 6 months is, of course, Macron himself, which is only to be expected because he is the president. So my point is that Zemmour has created a narrative around himself, which is something that always draws the press in. Who is Eric Zemmour? He's, as I said, he made a career for himself as a journalist for Le Figaro, and then a TV commentator, which is where he really came to public attention. He's a graduate of Sciences Po, was originally a man of the left, at least he voted on the left. He voted for Mitterrand in 1981 and 88. What seems to have begun to change his attitudes, his political attitudes, was his failure on the oral examination to enter the ENA. In the French media landscape, he really attracted a huge audience with the advent of the 24-hour cable news networks, particularly CNews, which is a new cable channel aspiring to become the Fox News of France. CNews is owned by Vincent Bolloré, who in the past has been a supporter of the center-right, but this year seems to have thrown his support to Zemmour. There's some speculation that Bolloré may be playing a double game because it was Zemmour's ability to split the far right that created an opening for Valérie Pécresse. Without Zemmour in the race, Le Pen was leading the Republican candidate in the generic polls by a considerable margin. So it was only the fact that Zemmour's emergence as a candidate created an opening that would have allowed Pécresse, had she run a better campaign, to become a viable candidate. But if that was the ploy, it seems to be failing. In any case, the result, the outcome seems to be that the ranking is now Le Pen, Zemmour, and Pécresse on the right. So we are, as long anticipated, probably going to have a second round, which will pit Macron against Le Pen. And as I say, the result will probably be a victory for Macron. That raises the question of what will happen in the future. And that's why I think you're seeing so many desertions from both Le Pen's party and the Republican Party. I mentioned the Republican desertions before. Among desertions from Le Pen, I mentioned her niece and her father. There's also the only senator from Le Pen's party, Stéphane Ravier, who has gone to Zemmour. So clearly, many politicians on the right have decided that what's going to emerge from this election is a new constellation of the right. There's going to be a right-wing technocratic party for which people like former Prime Minister Edouard Philippe and Finance Minister Eric Woerth will contend for the leadership. And there will be a kind of bourgeois nationalist party along the lines that Zemmour has laid out. Le Pen's party has become less a party of the far right than a party of the working class. Although she retains the xenophobic rhetoric of her father, her support now consists mainly of the working class, which has moved to the right because of opposition to immigration, and left room for a new kind of party on the right, a bourgeois nationalist party, which is what Zemmour, with his harking back to support for Pétain, invocation of de Gaulle as one of his heroes, and rethinking of France's role in World War II and the Algerian War. I think that's the territory he's trying to stake out. So what I think we see happening on the right is a political realignment. And I think I should stop there and turn the floor over to Philippe.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Art. This gives us quite a bit of material to think through. So to bring us the full spectrum and discuss the left, I'm delighted to introduce Philippe Marlière, who is joining us from London. He is a professor of French and European politics at University College London. He holds a PhD degree in social and political studies from the European University Institute in Florence. He was awarded the 2007 Chair of Politics at the Université Libre de Bruxelles in recognition of his work on European social democracy. Philippe Marlière researches political ideologies, party politics, and the French left. He's currently writing a book on Republican ideology in France. I heard him speak through NYU on COVID policies, so I know that is an extremely sensitive and timely matter as well. So I'm sure we'll hear quite a bit. Thank you, Philippe.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Hello, everyone. Thank you for your invitation. And extend my thanks to Art, because I think you basically covered the right, which is I'm now going to talk about the left. So I think it was a nice division of labor, so to speak. Yeah, I'm going to talk about the situation on the French left. I think it is an interesting topic because if you follow the French media, you will essentially get a lot of information and coverage about the French right, i.e. Macron, center-right, although now I think he's mostly considered in France as a kind of modern conservative. And then, of course, the different factions of the far right. And now we have this year two far-right candidates, Le Pen and Zemmour. Art discussed them, and I think he made a very good distinction between the two brands of far-right traditions that they both represent. So to get back to the French left, I'm going to make 3 points. I think the first one is to take a snapshot of the French left as it is before the election. I gave to Catherine a quite dramatic title for my talk, which is the staggering decline of the French left. Yeah, that sounds a bit dramatic, but I think it is pretty dramatic when you think about the sorry state of the French left today. To give you a sort of an idea of the dire situation the French left is in at the moment, it's a bit like, if you like, before a major election, all the components of, say, the Democratic Party in the US, you know, from the radical left, let's say Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, then Bernie Sanders, and the more centrist side of the party with Joe Biden would be basically swept away, you know, where they would be politically, although it's impossible to get the three candidates running at that election at the same time. You have a primary first, but it's a bit that, you know, the French left has multiple candidates running, and each of them is actually very weak. So, you know, Art said that it's a foregone conclusion Macron's going to win. Probably. I would have been less sure of that a few months ago, but it seems that now. And one of the effects of this awful war in Ukraine is that, of course, it's going to be good for his standing, because the French president, like the US one, is the chief of the armies. And I think unless he makes a very silly thing, it's going to be good for him, so to speak. It's going to work in his favor. So let's start with a snapshot. I think to give you an idea of the extent of how fragmented, divided the French left is, there would be probably between 5 and 7 candidates running, which is not totally unusual. Normally, at that election in the first round, there are multiple candidacies of left-wing candidates, and it's interesting because you really get candidates from the far left, i.e. the anti-capitalist Trotskyist left, and I think at some point, I think in some elections you had up to 3 of them running to become president of the French Republic. And then you have a communist candidate, you know, from the traditional Orthodox Parti Communiste Français, the French Communist Party. Then you will have a Green candidate. And then you will have a socialist candidate, which is the sort of social democratic candidate. So nowadays, very moderate, Parti Socialist, not socialist in the US sense, very moderate in France when you say socialist nowadays, social democratic. Let me put that in order. One candidate who was a former justice minister in during François Hollande's presidency, Christian Taubira, has had to pull out of the race. So Catherine said something interesting. It's a funny election with 2 rounds, and with a runoff best place candidate and the runner-up only qualify. So it's really, if Macron is quasi sure to get a spot for the second round, all the other candidates left and right are now competing for one place, so to speak. So you see, it's very, very hard to get there. And if you come third, that's it. You are eliminated from the race. So what is important here is that Christiane Taubira couldn't even get 500 signatures, i.e. the support from elected people. You know, could be a mayor, it could be a deputy in the National Assembly, it could be a senator. You have to get those 500 signatures. Why do we have that first hurdle to be able to run? It's because otherwise you could get, you know, hundreds of people running and candidates wouldn't be very serious. So it's a way to sort of set a threshold, and it works because Taubira, amazingly, who some people thought at some point, who won a so-called people's primary a couple of months ago, some people thought could really make a difference and revive the fortune of the left, in fact, couldn't even get the 500 signatures, and she pulled out of the race just yesterday. There are two other candidates, Trotskyists, who might not get the 500. Philippe Poutou, NPA, it's a Trotskyist party, or post-Trotskyist, and Anas Kazib, a Trotskyist as well. And they are struggling. There's still 24 hours to go. The deadline is tomorrow, by the way. So it's really, at the moment, both and their teams must be working hard to get those signatures. So let's concentrate on those who are sure, who have received already the signatures. We've got one social democratic candidate or socialist, Anne Hidalgo, who is quite a well-known figure in France because she happens to be the mayor of Paris. So it's the capital. She is quite an experienced politician. And we've got a Green candidate. His name is Yannick Jadot. Well, we've got one communist candidate. His name is Fabien Roussel. And then we've got Jean-Luc Mélenchon. Very hard to label position politically Mélenchon. He's a former socialist leader, or not leader, a member of the Socialist Party, once minister. And he sort of left the party some 10 years ago or so. Now he's a kind of left populist candidate. And then one, two, or three Trotskyist candidates. It will depend on whether two of them gets the signatures. So this is really the pool of candidates. So you might say, wow, that's a lot, really. And yes, that's a lot, but not unusual. If you compare to previous elections, sometimes there are 4 or 5 candidates, and sometimes you've got as many candidates and the left finally wins the big prize, the presidency. It's not going to happen this time round. And the total votes for the left will be, I reckon, very low, like 5 years ago, where I think in the first round, if you put all together the votes, the share of the vote for all left-wing candidates from the far left to the center left, the left only scored 27% of the share of the vote. So it means all the rest was conservative, right-wing, or far right. As we speak, the voting intentions are quite bad. There's only one candidate of the 5 or 6 which is above the 10% threshold in terms of voting intentions. Jean-Luc Mélenchon, between 10 and 12%. Mélenchon did very well 5 years ago. He almost got 20% of the share of the vote, came in 4th position, not so far from the second spot, you know, the one which enables you to qualify for the second round. So this is really the big question mark, in my opinion. Can he make a comeback, in a sense that people on the left, very desperate about the dire situation of the left, thinking it's going to be a rerun of 2017 Macron-Le Pen, very despairing, might vote for Mélenchon eventually. Let's call it tactical voting, not because they so much like Mélenchon or his program. Some of them might even be center-left moderate voters, But they will just do that because, above all, they are on the left. And it's important, you know, the French invented the division left and right, comes from the French Revolution. And they might do that, as they did to a large extent in 2017. So that's, in my view, the only question mark. If there's a revival, you know, a sort of a glimmer of a hope, it could be Mélenchon receiving votes from more moderate voters on the left at just in the last days or weeks of the campaign, because people are despair on the left, and they would rather vote for someone they even quite dislike, but who in the end belongs to their political camp. So behind him, you know, Jadot, Greens, about 5%, Roussel, the Communist, 3-4%, Hidalgo, the Mayor of Paris, Socialist, 2 to 3%, which is, I think, I'll get back to later on and have sort of discussed briefly the sorry state of the once hegemonic party of the left, the Socialists, not so long ago. And the Trotskyist candidates is between 0 and 1%. So this is where we are. And by contrast, the total, so the left hardly totals now 30% of the share of the vote in voting intentions. So the rest is for the right or the far right. Between 68 and 72% of the votes are credited to the right or the far right at the moment, and a good 30% for the two candidates of the far right, which is absolutely unseen. My second point now is looking at what I would call structural factors. I'm trying to explain, if you like, why such decline, why is it so deep, so entrenched, because 2017 wasn't a good election for the left, and it seems that this one, after 5 years of a president which the left in general profoundly dislikes, there's been lots of social movements against his economic policies. You've heard probably of the Yellow Vest movement, lots of critiques and so on and so forth, but still is largely ahead in the polls. That's a fact, it seems. And the left hasn't really recovered from the big loss of 5 years ago. So there's really something wrong going on. So structural factors, that election is not a good one for the left. It's hard to explain why, but I think there are structural reasons. It is de Gaulle's election. De Gaulle, when he implemented the new constitution in 1958, the constitution of the Fifth Republic, wanted the president, first of all, to be endowed with much more power than under the previous constitution, but also at some point he wanted the president to be directly elected by voters, by the people, which wasn't the case until 1962. And he changed the constitution, got it, and we had the first presidential election with by universal suffrage, people voting directly, like in the US. But the difference in the US, you vote indirectly for your president. You vote for representatives who in turn are going to vote in states who in turn are going to cast their vote for the president. Here it's people really has one vote, you cast your vote and you vote really for one person. So it's a very personalized vote, you might say, in the US too, but I would say even more. There's no filter, if you like. And it's not a type of election where traditionally the left thrives on. Traditionally the left is probably better at, is more collegial, preparing programs, insisting on ideas and policies. Here, the game has always been, and even more today than in previous decades, about personalities. Those the candidate has a kind of presidential profile. And in the age of social media and of course televised debates and exchanges, I think the image of the candidate is extremely important. It was always like that, but I would say until the 1990s, I think and I think Art mentioned that in his speech, you had the French political parties were in much better health than they are now. I think that's another problem. Political parties on the left and right are really almost dying, you know, very few members. And of course, that has played into the hands of those who want to bypass the sort of the partisan organization. Look, the case of Macron 5 years ago, no party, he went it alone and he won it. That's the case again of Zemmour this time around. So this is really one of the aspects. When Mitterrand won in 1981, the first socialist president of the Fifth Republic, he won in 1981. You might argue he was a very experienced, very well-known figure, very charismatic, but at the same time, he had a strong socialist party backing him. He was tied up to a political program, the so-called 110 propositions for France. He had political allies, the communists and so on, and he had the trade unions behind. All that is gone. Trade unions nowadays no longer call for no longer support, if you like, directly any candidate. Last point in my second part is that Art said the Le Pen's party has become the working class party. I would say it is true to a large extent. Yes, that's a fact, which means that the left has lost to a very large extent the support of the working class. A lot of working class voters, by the way, abstain. That's the situation. If you like, the working class people in general vote for the abstention party, which of course doesn't exist, but they do not vote anymore. And when they vote, yes, they vote first of all for Le Pen and then marginally for the left. So that's a big change. And to finish this second part, I think there's been so far 9 presidential elections since 1965, direct election, and the left has only won 3 times. So that really shows that it's a very difficult election for the left to win. Third and last point, contextual factors, you know, trying to explain the decline by what has been going on the past few years, and with also sort of factors affecting French political life today. There's been, in the previous paper, also mentioned to the role played by the media. I agree with that. It's a very interesting point because it gives, of course, a different tempo, a different pace to debates. The pandemic has also made it less obvious that there will be, for instance, large rallies. The French traditionally loved large rallies, you know, public rallies. I don't think there'll be many of them now. And it's all things happening on TV, and with the rise in particular of private channels, the case of CNews, which is, yes, I agree, a kind of, if you know, of course, Fox News in the US, CNews is about that. It's a French version of Fox News. It's very right-wing. It gives a platform to people who until recently were clearly labeled on the far right of the French political spectrum. I'm not saying that they're all far-right journalists, but some of them are. They wouldn't appear on TV, and they're just there. And a lot of things goes on there, you know, like Zemmour. Zemmour, before becoming this candidate and a politician, now in third position, was a pundit. He was not even a journalist, a pundit specializing in migrant and foreigners bashing, notably in particular Muslim bashing, Islamophobia. I mean, the man has been condemned by French justice twice for incitement to racial hatred. This is very serious. He's in third position. So this is where we are, and he was given this platform to really develop, to spout out his revisionist views on the Dreyfus affair, the Vichy regime and French Jews, Algeria, and as I said, all the Islamophobia and racism going, you know, unchecked on these channels. And I think the worrying thing is that those far-right ideas, there's been a kind of a mainstreaming of those ideas. going to give you an example, which is probably the most shocking of all, which is recent, is that the theory of the Great Replacement theory, which is basically a white supremacist theory, the idea is that due to mass immigration, the French population, the indigenous French population, is being replaced by migrants coming from Africa, North Africa, and other parts of Africa, basically French former colonies. And it's a theory which is, by the way, has been used by the Christchurch killer. You know, he referred to it. It's one which has been theorized by a French far-right writer called Renaud Camus. And the theory is so far-fetched and extreme that even Marine Le Pen doesn't want to engage with it. So imagine. So, but Zemmour was given a platform to really go along with that. And more worrying, as I said, is that the main conservative candidate, Valérie Pécresse, I think we hadn't mentioned the name yet, Valérie Pécresse, for the post-Gaullist party, has referred to it and has said that absolutely there's something going on which is called the Great Replacement. So this is the situation we're in France. The left is fragmented. Mélenchon came first in 2017, 20%. I think probably the good strategy for anyone coming first with 20%, very promising score, in a left which is fragmented and weak, would have been to say, well, let's unite, let's do something. He didn't do that. He didn't do that because doing that would have meant probably compromising, sharing his power with other parties and leaders from other parties of the left. And probably his strategy has been since 2017 to wait for other parties of the left to be basically to go down, and to get the votes from the people who traditionally have been supporting other parties. It's not really working. It's still ahead, but it's not really working. Socialist Party, I would call it, it's the process of PASOKization, named after PASOK, the Greek Social Democratic Party, who lost almost 40% of the share of the vote in a period of 6 years in Greece a few years ago. I think it is happening for, yes?
You're over 20 minutes, so I was wondering if you could just
I'm really sorry.
time.
So,
yeah.
Okay, so I'll leave it there because I've been too long. I'm really sorry about that. Apologies.
No, thank you. I just want to make sure we have time for everyone.
Absolutely, I'm sorry.
Thank you so much. And we can always come back to a lot of this in the Q&A, so we can definitely come back to many of these ideas. And I think what's interesting is that some of these identity politics material that you were just concluding on are actually going to be a really great bridge to our third speaker, Rimsara Alouane. So I'm delighted to introduce her now. She is a French legal scholar and a Ph.D. candidate in comparative law at the Université Toulouse-Capitole in France. And so she is joining us from our third time zone of the event in Toulouse, and where her research focuses on religious freedom, civil liberties, constitutional law, and human rights in Europe and North America. Ms. Alouane frequently appears on TV and radio here in the US and worldwide, including NPR, Al Jazeera, the BBC, CBC, ABC Australia, and France 24 or France 24, where she discusses discrimination, human rights violations, and politics. And I would strongly recommend following her on Twitter. She has wonderful commentary and reaches a very wide audience through her Twitter handle as well. So Rimsara, I'm delighted to introduce you to talk about French identity politics in this election.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Thank you for the kind invitation. And I would like to thank Professors Goldhammer and Marlière, because you both did a wonderful transition for my talk. So I will try today to explain you the role of identity politics and how it plays into that election. So if you want a bit my thought on the results of the election, I would say that the French presidential election is always full of surprise. Sometimes one event can lead to a total different result, totally different from what we expected, even though I agree with both of you, especially since the latest international affairs event. Emmanuel Macron has chances indeed to be re-elected, but I would say wait and see, because I usually am among those who don't exactly trust polls either. So we shall see. Anyway, in the midst of the presidential campaign here in France, the political debate often has centered on identity issues at the expense maybe on more pressing issues, such as the pandemic, the dismantlement of our public services, unemployment, the rise of poverty, which has been even more visible during our confinement, and so on. And nevertheless, this should not really surprise us, as the question of national identity, of identity politic, this neo-Republican discourse is fully part of this game, which is the French presidential election. If you follow France's news, France's political news, you will notice how often our politicians, both from the far right to the left, so really across the political spectrum, have been blaming people, more marginalized people, such as people of color, Muslims, different vulnerable minorities, of playing identity politics, of importing, I quote, racial wars from the United States that threaten the unity of the country, while at the same time, these parties, and I will show you how, have been using identity politics for a while to advance their agenda. I will start sharing my screen. I hope this time it will work. I don't know if it's working for you.
Yep, all good.
Yeah, excellent. So I will try to show you how disingenuous it is. And for that, I will go, I'm sorry, through history a little bit so you can understand the current events. And of course, I will start with the far right. So in an interview in 2020 for a weekly magazine, L'Express, Emmanuel Macron raised the following question: what does it mean to be French? And he said, the question to which we must answer is both simple and difficult. What does it mean to be French? The doubt has fed on phenomena which, like migration, have created a form of cultural insecurity, and which leads to wondering what it means to be French. Emmanuel Macron used that expression, cultural insecurity, which has been penned by Laurent Bouvet, the founder of this organization called the Printemps Républicain, the Republican Spring, which is a left-wing organization who has an extremely neo-Republican, illiberal view on laïcité. So they advocate for a very restricted interpretation of laïcité, so really hardliner secularists, which lobby the government on policies regarding separation of church and state, and especially on the visibility of religion when it comes to Muslims, really. Emmanuel Macron believes that the French have, according to him, the fierce absolute will to take back control of France as a nation. To take back control is an element of language of the far right, that the far right has been using, that France is lost to Europe, to migrants, to immigration, and also the Brexiter in the United Kingdom who wanted control back from the EU. So Macron's rightward pivot needs to be read as a calculated electoral strategy against Marine Le Pen, who made the second round of the election in 2017, but also more recently with Éric Zemmour, the new star of the far right, if I may say. And centrist parties, as well as the traditional right wing, but also a part of the Socialist Party, have ceded the French political field to the talking point, the key points advanced by the Front National, now the National Rally since 2018, which are public order, especially through security, immigration, and Islam. So this disingenuous obsession over identity, which at this point became a piece of what I would call political theater, really, is the culmination actually of a century-old process during which the concept of identity gradually imposed itself, and first within the so-called intellectual far right, but also now more widely across the political spectrum, and again, including the left wing. So of course, I'm not going back to 100-year-old of history. I would need like 4 hours, but I would try to give you the key, the main points so you can have an overview of what's going on here in France. So first of all, the exploitation of identity by the far right. So it was the work of at that time, at least, a new generation of intellectuals marked in particular by Maurice Barrès and Charles Maurras, which constitutes the ideological base of far-right political forces throughout the 20th century, who were supposed to defend France against the enemies who attacked it, and who challenged the Republican parliamentarism as well as liberal democracy. The National Leagues back in 1934 demonstrated near the Chamber of Deputies to protest against what they considered an inefficient and corrupted republic. And the Leagues intended to bring back, I quote, France to the French, which should ring a bell because that's still an expression the far right as well as the right wing is still using. The National Revolution launched in 1940 by the regime of Marshal Pétain, Philippe Pétain, intended to restore, in the shadow of Nazi Germany, a largely fantasized French identity marked in particular by Catholicism and rurality, something that, again, you need to keep in mind because those elements of language are still used until today. So the compromises of the collaboration cast lasting opprobrium not only on the Vichy regime, but also on the far right. And the question of identity, however, has been embraced by Charles de Gaulle, who tried to make it more friendly, who tried to make it more, to claim it back and make it more compatible with the, I quote, values of the Republic. But it was when Gaullism started to decline after the 60s, so after, especially after decolonization at the end of the 60s, that the identity-based far right reappeared with, again, their circle of intellectuals. And the ideology here was based on the idea that there was a decline of France, marked particularly by the loss of France's colonies, the end of the empire, and the risk of dilution in a Western Europe dominated by the United States. So again, keep in mind, there is also at stake a very strong anti-USA sentiment here. It also exploits the anxiety vis-a-vis globalization as well as post-colonial immigration. So the far right here intended to defend what they deemed was French identity, evoking the routines of individual into one community, itself part of 1,000-year-old European civilization, which apparently, according to them, was threatened by North African Muslim immigration. And, you know, of course, I'm going fast here, but it is on this idea that the Front National, so the far right 1.0, was created in 1972 by Jean-Marie Le Pen Sr., so the father of Marine Le Pen. Oh, I don't know. Is it working? Yes. In 1978, the Front National launched well, first of all, I should go back to the initial point. So immigration and immigrants at that time were blamed for the rise of insecurity. And that was symbolized by one very important event, one of the first massive riot in France in Les Minguettes, which is a banlieue, a very poor suburb of near Lyon, so we call it the hot summer of Les Minguettes. which has inspired the march against racism and for equality from Marseille to Paris. And so insecurity was the first point. And the second point as well was unemployment. And in 1978, the Front National of Jean-Marie Le Pen started to launch a campaign poster around the slogan, 1 million unemployed is 1 million immigrants too many. A slogan, of course, that he updated in 1982, rising the figure to 3 million unemployed immigrants and so on. The narrative used by the Front National almost obsessively exploit the danger of immigration, willingly resorting to provocations. Jean-Marie Le Pen in 1984 prophesied how tomorrow immigrants will stay with you, eat your soup and sleep with your wife, your daughter, and your son. So I think you guess the picture here. If only this would be contained within the far right, except that recently, or relatively recently, of course it didn't happen overnight, this whole rhetoric went beyond the realm of the far right and has somehow infested, contaminated more mainstream party, whether it's the traditional right wing, the conservative, but also again, a part of the left as well. And I will mainly focus on the right wing and later La République En Marche. So the exploitation of political identity outside the realm of the far right. Until the beginning of the 21st century, the theme of national identity nevertheless remained quite marginal. So really within the political field and was confined with the far right. However, during the 2002 election, the debate really focused on national sovereignty, defended by left-wing sovereignist Jean-Pierre Chevènement, at the head at that time of the Pôle républicain, the Republican pole, where he brought together left and right sovereignists who aimed to defend France and the values of the French Republic, as well as addressing the issues regarding insecurity and so on, a topic that has been central afterwards in the second round of the presidential election of 2002, opposing Jacques Chirac against Jean-Marie Le Pen. But 5 years later, 2007, a neat shift towards the far right has occurred in the traditional right-wing party. Nicolas Sarkozy, when he became president and implement one of his campaign promise, created the controversial Ministry of Immigration, Integration, National Identity, and yes, that's rich, Solidarity Development. It was an emblematic, like I said, promise of his campaign and a very divisive one. It's a proposal that led his socialist competitor, Ségolène Royal, to even take a stance on those issues on immigration and became part of a broader theme, the question of national identity, which allowed Nicolas Sarkozy to attract more than a third of the usual National Front voters to win that election. The trivialization of the question of identity can be explained by two main factors. I chose two, of course, there are many, but unfortunately, time-wise, I have to focus on two only. The rise of Islamist terrorist attacks across the country that was marked by successive wave of attacks since the mid-80s. Those attacks has shifted the political debate. What is at stake now is not really longer the threat of mass immigration, even though we are still discussing it, of course, or unemployment of native-born French people, le français de souche, or their daily security. But what is at stake now, what we are using as a key element of language is the threat of the survival of the French national identity shaped by Christianity and threatened by Muslims, because unfortunately we don't make the difference between terrorists and random Muslims who just want to live their lives, really. First factor. Second factor, the fear of what we call here communautarism. it's very difficult to translate communitarianism, even though I don't really like the translation, but sorry, I can't really come with a better term. But this idea that today we have born in French generation of people of immigrant background, but really who were born and raised here, who know about the situation they are here, who are aware about discrimination, and who start to raise their voice, maybe contrary to their parents who at that time feared to raise their voice on the way they were treated, of fearing they would be deported, right? And of course, the fear of a US-style multiculturalism in France. And this shift was accelerated in 1989 with the infamous headscarf affair in Creil, where a couple of students from a public high school were expelled on the ground that they were violating laïcité by wearing a headscarf. And the fight here is a double threat: terrorism and multiculturalism slash laïcité and so on. On laïcité now, really quickly, I considered that that's what I call the weaponization of laïcité. Since the arrival of an important Muslim population in metropolitan France after decolonization, France has struggled with its identity and its culture. The changing interpretation of laïcité, which was first intended, I will not translate it by secularism because I think it's an inaccurate translation. It's a concept that was first intended to guarantee a strict state neutrality for civil servants, for the state, in order to protect religious freedom and freedom of conscience. And it was theorized in the law of 1905 on separation of church and state. And of course, freedom of religion and conscience limited by public order. So this concept, which is a liberal concept, has been weaponized to become a tool for political identity used by the right wing, the far right, but also by the left to target the visibility of religion in the public square, and especially the visibility of Islam, which is perceived as a threat to the so-called cultural and republican values. So this has resulted in a toughening, look, in matter of policies, this has resulted in a toughening of legislative narrative on religious science, again, across the political spectrum. You have them here in 2004, the prohibition of conspicuous religious signs in public school, in reality targeting the wearing of the headscarf. In 2010, using the public order argument, the prohibition of the concealment of the face in public, in reality targeting a very little minority of Muslim women wearing the niqab, so they conceal their face with that type of garment. In 2016, a series of burqaning bans, which were overturned by the Council of State, but until today, this has opened the door to a very toxic conversation on the visibility of Muslim women. And of course, more recently, the 2021 law strengthening the respect of Republican values, also known as anti-separatism law. And the affirmation of the pride of being French, which Nicolas Sarkozy pushed forward and expressed by promoting a conception of history which reconcile the French with the roman national, which I think we can translate with the national myth, through a very 19th century style glorification of a certain vision of France. Like in a meeting, he declared that the moment you become French, your ancestors are the Gallics, which is historically speaking inaccurate, but also which, again, go after minorities who don't come from Western Europe or the West in general. But also the refusal to apologize or even repent for crimes that France has committed when it was a colonial power, so the colonial past of France. And for example, in 2016, again, while running for the right-wing primary, François Fillon declared bluntly that France is not guilty of having wanted to share its culture with the peoples of Africa. And more recently, Éric Zemmour, in November of 2021, when he announced a video, through a video that he was running for office, declared that he wanted to save France. So you still have this idea that France is at stake in the hand of minorities, of multiculturalism, the threat of globalization. And I'll let you read this completely wild statement, which again show this weaponization of identity by the right wing, but also the far right. Again, it could have been contained, but this phenomenon has been amplified. You would think that maybe President Macron's victory in 2017 would put an end, or at least halt this movement. Unfortunately, on the contrary, it got worse. And in seeking re-election in 2017, for what it was, Macron didn't play really that game. He brought more of a European project, and it served him quite well. But again, following recent terrorist attacks, Macron's party and his administration shifted towards the right, and not to say the far right. And to orchestrate and serve as a symbol of this government shake-up, he appointed a very controversial figure as Minister of Interior, one of the most powerful ministry here in France, Gérald Darmanin, who is from the French Conservative Party, and he defected to join La République En Marche. And he is quite famous for his hot takes. So for example, while discussing at the beginning of the discussion on about the future law, anti-separatism law, he declared on live television that he was shocked by the existence of ethnic food aisle, and especially halal and kosher. And for him, it's communautarism, which can lead to separatism, which can itself lead to radicalization. He also has been accused for anti-Muslim bigotry and is again famous for inflammatory rhetoric and action. Darmanin's appointment and tenure was proven to be controversial. He's loved by the left, and the right wing is suspicious towards him. And he really still remains a strong conservative and very close to Nicolas Sarkozy. And as a vivid illustration of the Macron administration rightward shift, last year, and that's rich, right? Gérald Darmanin accused Marine Le Pen of being a bit too wobbly and a bit soft on Islam. Again, we were still debating the anti-separatism law. And you would ask him, but no, it's a political game. They do not want to gather the voters of the far right. Well, Gérald Darmanin blatantly announced that he wished that the voter of the National Front, so the National Right now, to vote for them because La République En Marche, the Macron's administration, can respond to their anger. So in other words, to win a French election today, you need to surf on the wave of the far right ideology. Towards a far right 3.0, and I will wrap up quite
fast. You're over 20 minutes, so yeah,
I will definitely do that. We saw Éric Zemmour, who clearly is a revisionist, has named his movement after La Reconquista, the Spanish, Andalusian, Arab Andalusian Spain by Catholics at the end of Middle Ages. So what are we witnessing here is clearly a far rightization of mainstream party. You can see Éric Zemmour. It's also the case with Valérie Pécresse and her hot takes, and how big in French is to have a Christmas tree, eating foie gras, electing Miss France, and the Tour de France, because of course, if you are a person of color, you cannot be, or a minority or a Muslim, you cannot be part or fully part of the fabric of this country. We can, if you have any question, I can show you the slide afterwards. But to quickly wrap up, and of course, the question of Islamo-leftism, which is quite ironic. If you have any question, I will gladly respond. And as a conclusion, I think that the media success of Éric Zemmour is somehow the national conclusion of a year of tribalization of far-right ideology across the political spectrum, which clearly has went from being a taboo to normalized in the political field as well as in the media. A normalization, I think, that has been allowed by Trump being president. And I honestly don't think it's gonna get any better soon. But it's still time to act. And now let's see on which field Macron is going to play for the upcoming election. And I'm so sorry if I took too much time.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I think you probably need to end your screen share and we can come back together as a group. Yeah, so we still have about 15 minutes for Q&A for all three of our speakers. I want to make sure that I give priority to the participants. So I will let you guys, I mean, I can always ask a bunch of questions, but I think I want to make sure that our participants have a chance. Feel free to raise your hand or put something in the chat if anyone wants to either ask in haute voix, you know, in live voice, or to add something to the chat. That's also fine. I guess I see someone. Okay, I guess if we don't have any hands raised, I'll give people a chance to think. But I guess I would ask the elephant in the room question of yes, I'm seeing too much to think about as a comment. The elephant in the room question. I know that, you know, all three of you have kind of briefly mentioned how Ukraine and the conflict has you know, strengthened Macron's hand in a certain way. But I was just wondering, you know, one thing I've been following is how the other candidates have been responding to Macron's handling of Ukraine. And one thing that has struck me is that the criticisms I'm seeing are not really about the handling of Ukraine itself, but about the handling of the election, and saying, you know, oh, he's using this as a pretext to, you know, assert his own authority. He's using this as a way to minimize the elections, or, you know, just how the criticism ends up not actually being about the matter at hand and about the election instead. So I'm just curious, you know, what are you thinking about? What are you following as you watch this unfold? For anyone.
Unmute, unmute.
Yeah, I think it's quite standard for candidates to accuse the sitting president of using his position, no matter what the issue is, unfairly. And it's true that the president naturally dominates airtime, much more so in a situation like this where a war is threatening. I think Rim Sarah is quite right to note the shift toward the far right positions of all the parties, including Macron. But I think that's going to be greatly minimized going forward because of the situation in Ukraine. Particularly, the war in Ukraine undermines the position of Éric Zemmour, who had been an outspoken supporter of Russia and Putin in particular. So I think to the extent that he was driving the shift to the far right, that issue is now going to be much less prominent than it would have been otherwise.
A point about the reaction to Macron's handling of the war, or the sort of the pre-war situation. I think you may remember he went to visit, he went to meet with Putin in Moscow just days before the Russian invasion. And he said that he had got a deal out of that meeting, you know, that in fact things will de-escalate. That was the sort of, in a nutshell, outcome of that meeting. That was really literally days before the invasion a week ago. So that was about 2 weeks ago. And of course, when Putin launched his tanks to Ukraine, that was really used by his opponents. You know, they mocked him. They tried to ridicule him, to say, well, he had no clue, and he had been ridiculed by Putin. But of course, a week is a long time in politics, and now it looks like all those criticism were a bit, to say the least, harsh, because what can you do when you have facing you in any negotiation someone who is just doesn't keep his promises or his pledges? And so on the whole, I think, and I think the fiercest criticism were coming from those, the three candidates who have been in the past really quite close to Putin's position, i.e. Zemmour, Le Pen, but also Mélenchon. So in fact, and I agree with Art, I think the one which will sort of be hit the most by the whole war sequence of all candidates is Zemmour. And he made another faux pas just now, which is about the refugees, the Ukrainian refugees. Said France is not taking any refugees. We're not doing that. And there was outcry in France because people at the moment, at least, are very willing to take refugees. So of course, there's another subplot about people are willing to take refugees from Europe, Ukrainians, but not from Africa. That's a fair point to make. But in general, there's a lot of goodwill at the moment in Europe to welcome refugees. And I think it was a complete faux pas. So I think it's going to be hit by that.
I completely agree with my co-panelists, and I will add, I think Marine Le Pen will also pay the price, because let's not forget the close ties she had with the Russian government, and how she sought for funding as well for her previous campaigns in Russia, which at that time already caused an outcry. And we all know how Russia interferes with our politics, and especially by funding and amplifying the far right, whether it is with money, but also through social media campaigns and sometimes even hacking. Which happened, I don't know if you remember, like at the previous, was it? But anyway, like we all know it happens. And so I think Marine Le Pen will pay the price, because we saw her pivoted as well recently when it comes to the invasion in Ukraine. So I think in matter of foreign policies, like both made incredible faux pas during their career and most recently in their political campaign. So wait and see. You said like a week is a long time, but the elections are in April, so it's even longer. But I think indeed, like Ukraine will be the turning point.
Very good. Thank you so much. I did receive a question via the chat just to me, but it was a question for Monsieur Marlière, actually from one of my students in my contemporary France class, wanting to know about your take on Mélenchon and La France Insoumise, and in particular its connection to youth, and how it has this kind of hold on youth fascination, and how you interpret that. And I always think of the kind of Bernie Sanders enthusiasm as a parallel, but what are your thoughts on La France Insoumise and its attraction or attractivity to younger French?
It's a very good point. It's a very good question, because yes, there is indeed a kind of interest on the part of the youth in France, those at least who vote and who care about politics, and a lot of them do, in sort of supporting Mélenchon. Mélenchon has been quite good to surround himself, and it's always been like that, with younger activists, and also his use of new technologies is quite phenomenal. You know, he's been always on the forefront of all those things. So this is a paradox. Is a 71-year-old man who's been in politics for 45 years. You know, he's been really a professional politician, and who's now been quite able to reinvent himself as a left winger, which he wasn't 20 years ago, and also a man with the support of the young, which translates into, in 2017, yes, a lot of younger people, 18, 24 years old, voted for him. Also good at attracting on the left some working class voters as well, both. I think that was really very positive outcomes of his campaign. Let's see if he retains that the youth vote and the parallel with Bernie Sanders. Yes, probably there's a bit of that. And at least, yes, you have to concede that he's been quite good at capturing the young vote.
Thank you. I haven't seen any others in the chat. I know that my colleague and co-collaborator, Hillary Silver, also has a question.
Okay, I was hoping some students would get into the fray, so let me encourage you out, if you're out there, to do so. My question is a little bit about Macron's image of Europe. Oh, there's a hand, great. Is a bit about Macron's ambitions for Europe, in a sense of going it alone, an autonomy, particularly for security in Europe. And the extent to which, his visit to Putin just now sort of tried to distance Europe from the United States and NATO, trying to provide a justification for European security policy. And there's an element of that also that, I saw the poster for Islamo-Gauchism on the wall in your photograph. And, there really is a kind of this current of anti-Europeanism used to incite the far right in France. But this anti-Americanism also can play this role, right? So that the nationalist impulse, you need to have somebody to push against, right? And Macron is using a little bit the anti-American feeling in France a little bit to advance his view of European autonomy. So I'm just wondering, is any of this back in the theme of this election? It was obviously important in the previous one.
Yes, I would say that in 2017, Macron made a great deal of his vision of Europe. He put it forward in a number of very lyrical speeches. Unfortunately, it went nowhere because Angela Merkel refused to meet him halfway. He was going to de-emphasize that theme because it hadn't done much for him domestically in this election. Now it's revived a bit by his role in negotiating with Europe. But his problem now is that Germany has reemerged as a European power. The German government overnight has transformed its view of European policy and its relation to European military policy in particular. And Germany is the natural leader of Europe, whatever Macron might think and however eloquent his speeches on the subject are. So I'm afraid he's going to be overshadowed by what the Germans decide to do, including the 100 billion infusion of 100 billion euros into the military to happen immediately. That's going to change things overnight in Europe.
Although I can't.
I agree.
Go on. Go on.
I agree with what Art just said, and also I think Hillary, you said that basically he's trying to stay away from the US in order to sort of build a kind of European coalition, so to speak. There's probably a bit of that. It's probably a bit of that because he's very interested in sort of in European integration. He hasn't done so much, to be fair, in the first 5 years. He hasn't done so much, wasn't helped much by Merkel, to be fair. So it's a bit of probably also the Trump presidency made it sort of imperative for him to look to Europe instead of the US. Anyway, we're not, France isn't the UK or even Germany or even Poland, France being France. Being a bit of anti-Americanism in French politics, particularly before election, is always a vote winner. from the far left to the far right. You know, there's a kind. I don't think Macron overdoes that, because culturally he's probably the one who is closest to American culture and understanding America and whatever. So I think there's a bit of that, but yes, you know, anti-Americanism and anti-Europeanism also. And in fact, you can have both. With someone like Mélenchon on the left, you have both. Because it plays down very well at the moment with a certain electorate, which is very much anti-elite, anti-capitalism in a very vague sense. You know, that's the sort of thing Europe being described now on the far left and the far right in some circles as, you know, the sort of diabolical neoliberal capitalistic club, and America being America, of course. So that's really, again, is something you get very much. Mélenchon, just to finish, came up in a run-up to the war here and in this campaign with the theory of non-alignment. Even de Gaulle never talked about non-alignment. What de Gaulle did is to take France off the NATO command. You know, he didn't take France outside NATO, but Mélenchon would like to do that if elected president. He's talking about non-alignment. He's not being much challenged by the media about that. How do you do that? The cost of it, politically, geopolitically, what does that mean? And I think he's not being challenged, probably because the media don't do their homework and don't ask the right question, but also because of that thing of being non-aligned is a good thing. You know, it flatters French nationalism.
Yeah, I agree.
And I know that my student, actually Ian, has been patiently waiting. I want to make sure, Ian, you get a chance to ask your question. So we'll take Ian as our last question. Thank you.
First off, I'd just like to thank all the presenters today, the panel. It's been really great hearing perspectives and just kind of a whole range of ideas concerning the election. My main question, we've been talking about great power competition a little bit in terms of the Ukraine crisis and how Macron's response to this and his strategy of non-alignment and potentially strategic autonomy may be called into question during the election. I'd like to actually turn the foreign policy angle a little bit more to Africa as well. Recently, we've seen France pulling out of Mali as part of Operation Barkhane, and a relative diminution of operations, counterterrorism operations in the Sahel. Just very quickly, to what extent do the panelists see this playing a role in the elections?
And I should add, we've been talking a lot about the Mali-Russia connection in my contemporary France class.
Yeah, frankly, the question catches me off guard because the events in Ukraine have transformed everything in France's global stance. And I think the withdrawal from Mali will now have to be rethought in light of everything that has transpired in the last week. When we think about Macron's position in the world, let's not forget that Macron is the one, despite his commitment to French leadership of Europe, he's the one who said at the beginning of his presidency that NATO is brain dead. In retrospect, that doesn't look so good. NATO is now once again on the front lines of resistance to Russian aggression. So Macron will have to recalibrate his own attitudes toward these institutions of the Cold War, which, to be fair to Macron, it did seem moribund at the time that he made his remark. But I think all nations are now going to be reevaluating their positions with respect to Russia and what that means for their stance throughout the rest of the world, including Africa.
I think I'll make a wider point. Also, it's not the Mali situation is not one which I'm fully acquainted with and knowledgeable about, but simply to say, well, the Mali situation is part of a broader situation of France in Africa, France-Afrique, as they once put it, of losing influence there, simply. I think France has been, over the past decades losing progressively influence, and and of course, Putin seeing that as trying, and also the Chinese are doing the same, are trying to seize the opportunity there to get in and replacement of France. And it's a question of military power, economic power, and I think things are yes changing. But I agree with Art probably that Macron will think twice about sort of moving his troops from any spot in Africa now that he thinks, rightly or wrongly, that the Russian might replace them or something. But it's a very difficult question, and the sort of this struggle between major imperial powers, because France, Russia, the US are all imperial powers, is only starting there, because really Russia, China are really coming now. So it's been happening for a few years, of course, but it's going to happen now. And I think I'm not really an expert, so I'll just leave it there.
If I might add a comment, same, I'm definitely not an expert on Mali, so I won't go into this outside my field of specialty, but more broadly, I think that a couple of things. France today, whoever win the election, need to rethink who she wants to be and its place in the world. And right now, I feel like it's stuck in between two blocks, so the United States and the EU, but really Germany. And while trying to really be France with a capital F and basically back to its higher position, it seems always stuck by certain element that prevents France from being basically Germany today, or the US on the other side of the Atlantic. So what does France want? And I don't think we have figured out just yet. And regarding Africa, I mean, the African continent and Transafrica, I completely agree. And I would go even further. I think France just received a huge slap in the face. Because I think it should have seen coming the whole thing. China and Russia played the neo-imperialist game for a long time on the African continent, and the left let it happen and actually isn't even bothered by it, or most of the left, should I say. And I think that until France comes to the conclusion that it needs to have equal relation with African countries, and not imperialistic ones, because let's face it, we are not on the same level with our African countries partners. We are losing, and clearly we cannot get out of this mess if we don't finally take our partners in Africa on the same level. But for that, we need to go beyond our colonial past, and so far we haven't done a good job at it. Even though, for what it is, Macron has took a couple of steps forwards, but it's 10 steps backwards before the election. So I think we need to rethink our position as an equal partner and not a neo-imperialist power like Russia and China are doing at the moment. But again, that's just my 2 cents, and I won't commenting any further on Mali because it's not my field of expertise.
Thank you so much. I know that we're over time, and I know my students, at least, a lot of them have other classes and other commitments. So I just want to take this opportunity to thank all 3 of our participants, and to thank all of our panelists, both our panelists and our audience as well, for attending and asking such great questions. This will be, to be continued. We've got 6 more weeks or so, so we'll see where things go in the next few months. Thank you again.